Good morning. I don't know. I'm running on fumes today, so we'll see how this goes. No, that's what I get to do the rest of the day today. I hope not. I hope it's still there when I get home. Probably that rat would probably still live. Justin, I can't believe you're telling someone to clean. All right, focus. 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 Anna, would you mind opening us up in prayer this morning? Amen. All right, quick recap. So, Aurelian was successful in bringing back the empire, the Roman Empire, back to a unified empire after it had split into three. So he was able to bring the East back in the fold by defeating Zenobia, and also was successful in bringing at least the immediate western region, France, part of Germany, back into the Roman fold. And some key things to remember about his rule: he established basically monotheism within Rome, dedicating the sun god Sol as their primary deity. And he would kind of escalate what Rome would soon experience in inflation. So he had created more mints, where more money would be printed to support their growing efforts to stack up the military and expand their territory. So Aurelian is killed. And so if you remember, both the army and the Senate were arguing for one another to take responsibility and assign someone as emperor. The Senate didn't want to do it because their guys usually didn't last very long, and the army didn't want to do it because it would make them look like they were implicit in the killing of Aurelian. So finally, the Senate decides to pick a guy who was Tacitus, and just like they're concerned with them lasting very long, he lasted, I think it was 9 months, so didn't really get accomplished much. And then after him, we get Carus took his position as emperor and is immediately named his two sons co-emperors. So he left Carinus back in Rome, while him and his other son Numerian marched east to confront the Persians as they were going through a internal struggle with successors to take the throne. So Carus was able to further Rome's territory into Persia, even across the Tigris. But legend says that Carus was struck by lightning on his horse as a sign that he invaded too far into Persian territory. So the Romans kind of took that as a sign that they weren't, their border was kind of solidified on the other side of the Tigris. So, but that's a legend. Some believe he was just, the Cyprian plague was going around. So Numerian, they believe, fell to the Cyprian plague. If you remember, he was his father-in-law was issuing orders on his behalf, and eventually the legion started smelling a fishy smell out of his tent and went in to investigate, and he'd been dead for quite some time. So, and then I believe Carinus also fell to the plague as he was back in Rome. So to take their place, we have Diocletian. So Diocletian didn't really do anything to note, except he was able to basically maintain the defenses against the Franks, as the Franks and the Germans, as they were becoming more and more organized. They were no longer a bunch of disparate tribes. They were starting to unify, so making them a formidable enemy for Rome. And then actually, sorry, not him. Did I miss one? Oh, Probus, sorry. So Tacitus, Probus. Probus was the one that was dealing with the Germans and the Franks. Sorry. And then Carus took the throne after he died and advanced on Persia, was killed, and his sons died of plague. And then that's when Diocletian, who was kind of a no-name general, took the throne. So Diocletian was a very smart and methodical individual, and so he was able to establish a peace treaty with Persia for the time being, and he decided that to better rule Rome, for one, he would take the power from Rome, so it wasn't such an enticing object for those who want to lead revolts or set up co-emperors to want to march on and take. So he removed the capital of Rome and made what was it? Nicomedia the capital. So that is now the capital, Rome. And then to better manage the empire, Diocletian decides on a co-emperor who is Maximian. So he rules the west, while Diocletian rules the east. So Diocletian is dealing primarily with the Goths and maintaining peace with the Persians, while Maximian is dealing with the Franks and the Germans. And if you remember, they were also trying to take back Britain, and so he assigns one of his lead generals, Navy General Carausius, to overtake the Franks along the coast, western coast of France, and then advance into Britain. But Carausius is essentially a corrupt general, so he's taking kind of bribes and dealing with the Franks, and even goes as far as allowing them to loot Roman territory. And then after the looting was done, Carausius and his navy would go and capture them, and then take credit for capturing the pirates, but then would keep the loot for himself. So eventually Maximian names Carausius enemy of the state. So Carausius takes his navy, basically Rome's navy, Western Navy, and moves to Britain, as he's been able to establish a relationship with the Britannians and the Franks. So he's got bases set up on the western coast of France, and he establishes forts along the southeastern coast of England, along the English Channel. So he becomes essentially Augustus in Britain. So he's got his own little empire going, Carausius does. And so Maximian leads a naval effort against Carausius, but Carausius is a far more seasoned sailor, so he overtakes Maximian's navy, and so Maximian is dealt a heavy defeat. Basically the whole western naval fleet of Rome is wiped out. And so but Diocletian, if it was any other emperor, that probably would have humiliated Maximian, or worse, had him killed and replaced him. But Diocletian in his wisdom, thought, well, if I humiliate him, then eventually that may lead to a revolt, and he'll seek to take my place. So he supported Maximian, and also so he marches west to show that even though Rome suffered this heavy defeat, that Rome was still unified, the emperors are still unified. So and then Diocletian starts sharing his visions for basically reconstructing the empire. So out of those visions that Diocletian has, he proposes the tetrarch, what we now call the tetrarch. So to better manage the Roman territories and to be more responsive to encroaching enemies, he establishes two additional Augustuses. So this is when Constantius enters the scene, who is Constantine's father, and then Valerius. So Constantius, let me pick up in my notes here. So Galerius, upon becoming Augustus, is assigned or tasked to head east to deal with Egypt, as there is an uprising going on in Egypt. Why is Egypt such a major concern for Rome? Yeah.
The answer to your question is it's the breadbasket of
That's right.
the Roman Empire.
Curious if you know, how do you pronounce it?
Constantius.
At the beginning of his name, though, Josephus has that at the beginning of his name. Again, is that just a title, do you think, or Flavius Josephus, and then Flavius? Or is that a Latin?
I mean, I think most of their names have a meaning. I didn't really look into.
And that's cool.
Yeah.
Look that up.
It means golden or yellow.
Golden or yellow haired.
Because flavonoid means
Well, I'm reading it means steadfast, firm, resolute. The Latin name Constantius means constant, steadfast, firm, resolute.
Ooh, that's not Flavius.
Oh, Flavius. Oh, I don't know.
Yellow or golden hair.
Gotcha.
Commonly used in ancient Rome and is associated with the Flavian dynasty of emperors.
Yeah, so he's tasked with Galerius is tasked with dealing with a revolt in Egypt, and then he would head to the Persian border to deal with a newly invigorated Persian army led by their new king Narses. So Narses took the throne after Bahram II died, and then Narses killed Bahram III. And so then in 295, Narses broke the peace treaty that Diocletian had established with Persia. And so he would start marching his armies west to retake old Persian territory. And then Constantius was immediately given the task of overtaking Britain, which by this point had been out of Rome's control for roughly 7 years. So in 293, Constantius focused his efforts on the Franks along the coast of northern France in order to basically cut off the supply line to Britain to kind of choke out Carausius. And so he basically went scorched earth on the Franks along the coast, and this was a heavy blow to Carausius's legitimacy, and it left him open for a coup and eventually an assassination. So in 293, a British finance minister, Electus, led a group and killed Carausius. So then Electus took on the position of Augustus of Britain and left Britain wide open for Constantius, because he was, obviously wasn't he was a administrator. He wasn't a seasoned soldier, so he had no battle experience. So, first Constantius had to rebuild his army. So he basically spent 2 years after being assigned Augustus building a Roman fleet, and then in 2 years, within those 2 years, Rome was able to build 2 fleets. And then in 295, Constantius set off for Britain. And then upon arriving in Britain, one of the fleets basically set fire to all of their ships as a statement that Rome was there to stay. So the Romans were either going to take Britain or die trying. So Electus was unexperienced in war, and shortly upon arriving on the shores of Britain, Constantius's soldiers defeated and killed Electus. And then after Electus was defeated, basically the Franks that had been living in Britain, up until this point were ruled by Carausius. They received their funding from Carausius, so they were kind of beholden to his rules and regulations. So upon both him and Electus being killed, the Franks basically saw it as an opportunity to have free range over Britain. So they began sacking all the towns in southern Britain, working their way up to London. And so upon arriving on the shores of Britain, Constantius marched for London and was able to intercede the Franks and essentially saved the citizens of London from the Franks. So because of the Franks' defeat, when Constantius reached London, he was viewed as a hero and not as a tyrant of Rome. And Britain was reabsorbed back in the Roman Empire. So they, built statues of Constantius and his horse. So Galerius, on the other hand, in 296, as he's dealing with Egypt, left to go march on the borders of Syria to confront Narses and his invading army, but he suffered heavy losses and retreated back to Antioch. So Diocletian wasn't able to respond immediately to support him. Diocletian, which we'll get into probably next weekend. There's a lot of events that unfold due to his tax policies. Oh, sorry, the weekend after then. So Diocletian spent 9 months trying to quash the revolt in Alexandria in Egypt. He became so frustrated that he stated that he would slaughter every citizen until their blood raised to the knees of his horse. And so legacy goes that during battle, Diocletian's horse kneeled down, allowing the blood to touch its knees, which basically Diocletian saw as a sign from the gods and stopped his onslaught. And supposedly this is why they built a statue of Diocletian and his horse in Alexandria. So after putting down the revolt in Egypt, both Galerius and Diocletian went back to focus on the Persians. And so Galerius marched out once again to confront Narses, but this time he would do it through Armenia, the mountains of Armenia. And, the hope was that the slopes of the Armenian mountains would, hinder the heavily armored cavalry of the Persians. And so during the night, Galerius led a surprise attack on Narses' camp and captured the entire camp, including Narses' wife, his treasury, and the royal family, and then Narses escaped. So Galerius could have, at this point, they basically have the entire royal family, so they could have marched into Persia all the way to India. It was basically open season for them. But again, Diocletian, practiced moderation and wisdom, and so he decided on focusing on reestablishing peace with Persia. So they would negotiate territory and establish a border that would basically last for 40 years. So while Galerius and Constantine were busy expanding and solidifying the empire, Diocletian was busy establishing a new structure for Rome, focusing on 4 primary things. The first is redistricting of the empire, creating militarized provinces around the outskirts of the empire, and administrative provinces within the soft interior of Rome. So essentially, Diocletian doubled the number of provinces almost overnight. So by fracturing the size of the provinces, he cut down the amount of power a single commander and governor could hold. And smaller provinces meant that a single commander would hold usually just 1 legion. So 1 legion was roughly around 6,000 troops. He also wanted to divide up the more hardened and dangerous out provinces from the inner regions of Rome. These outer provinces would become military districts, while the inner districts would become economic based districts. So kind of like here, where you got our centers of our financial centers like New York, a lot of the major cities, where kind of the outskirt provinces are kind of the Egypt of the U.S. Providing our food source and resources. So he wanted the ministers of the outer provinces to focus on defense, while the ministers of the inner province would focus on the economy. This concept would evolve into what England would implement as townships, which would eventually be adopted by the U.S. So if anybody goes, well, I'm sure Jeff's familiar that, if you go to Michigan, they don't call them counties, they call them townships. Second separation of, so a second initiative was a separation of civilian and military career paths. So Diocletian thought it would be dangerous and inefficient for career soldiers to be running administrative offices, and the same for untrained senators to be leading armies. So Diocletian decreed that a political governor of a province and its chief military officer could no longer be the same person. So this would undercut the potential rebellion that could come up and would allow each leader to focus on their appointed task. So the general would take on the name of Dux, which was essentially a precursor to the office of Duke. So what would become the Duke? So now you've got all these provinces, and each province has both a governor and a military leader. His third initiative was a division of the army into two distinct forces. So you'd have the traditional legions, and then he had what created essentially a militia on the frontier. So Diocletian reduced the size of the legions from roughly 6,000 men to 1,000 men, but he increased the number of legions around the empire. So decreased the size of the legions, but increased the number of legions. Diocletian also instituted militia throughout the outer provinces, made up of part-time soldiers and part-time farmers. So this would allow Diocletian to increase the amount of men, but at the fraction of the cost. So he didn't pay, the part-time soldiers nearly as much as he did the legions. Yeah. I mean, they study this in, if you go to like the naval or, any of the military academies, they study a lot of his strategy. So this would help police the frontier lines and help the outer provinces become more self-sufficient. It would also help provide a warning if larger, more dangerous enemies were on their way. So overall, Diocletian increased the size of the army from 350,000 men to about 500,000 men. This included a method similar to modern-day drafts. So he would force people into the military. This increase in military force and decrease in productive labor force would cause a pretty significant economic hit for Rome, which we, again, we'll cover next week or 2 weeks. So how these three reforms would coordinate together to help defend Rome and destroy her enemies is called what we now call the defense in depth theory, which was proposed by Edward Ludwig. So, if you were to go to any of our, military academies, some of his books are taught or researched. One is called the Coup d'Etat, a Practical Handbook. So Ludwig proposed that Diocletian purposefully created what was essentially a military web, allowing the enemy to enter Rome territory, but making it impossible to both advance into the interior districts and to leave once the enemy made the decision to advance on Rome. So Diocletian set up his defense structure so that the militia would keep an eye out for the enemy from a series of small forts connected by military roads. And then behind them would be stationed cavalry units, and behind them would be 1 or 2 legion garrisons. So a large invasion force would be able to easily push past the militia, who would allow the advancement, but warn the cavalry and the legions, and then they would retreat back and lock themselves in their forts. then the invasion force would have two options. They could use the military roads for easy travel, but would then confront one of the heavily fortified camps, which would cost them time and resources, or they could bypass the camps, which would open them up for attack from the rear. So they could also take the option of abandoning the roads, but then their pace would be slowed considerably, usually preventing them from making it very far before they were met by the Roman response. So the enemy forces would quickly find themselves without access to provisions, and so they would either have to retreat or stick around long enough for every Roman legion in the region to collapse on them from all sides. So the debate is if this is really how the battles would go, and if this was actually the purposeful intent on Diocletian's part, or if it was just a, beneficial happenstance from the system that Diocletian put in place. So that's kind of the debate among, strategists. So that's, Edward Lutwig proposes that, that was all by design by Diocletian, while others think it was just a, coincidence in how that functioned. Yeah. So I'll stop there. So any comments or questions? I think that's all I had in there. Yeah. I meant to put on a map showing Rome's territory at this point. Obviously it's not at the point it was at their pinnacle, but Rome is, once again becoming, almost an impenetrable empire leading up to Constantine. So